Hey, Ocean man, I dig what you're laying down. Where can I learn more about this stuff? I don't have no clue. Good luck, man. So one of the big questions that I get from people watching the channel is, hey, where do I start if I'm interested in learning more about paganism and heathenry? And that's a question that honestly stumps me a little bit whenever I hear it. Even though I totally understand why the question exists, it's one that I had myself for like years before getting into the subject. And look, I'll tell you a little bit about how I started. I was chasing down resources for like ancient versions of Christianity, and I discovered Pelagianism, which is a heretical form of Christianity centered around the idea of intrinsic goodness of the soul. It's often labeled as original blessing as opposed to original sin. And the fact that Pelagius, the originator of this idea, was excommunicated from the Catholic Church for suggesting that humans were good, this was super interesting to me. And I wanted to know more about his ideas and his background. And through this, I started finding resources on Celtic Christianity, which is a form of Christianity in Ireland and Scotland that embraced Pelagianism and found itself very close to nature and gave reverence to nature as God's creation. And there seemed to be a theme there that closeness to nature was closeness to God. And as a Christian, I jived with this at the time. So I looked closer, and I later discovered that much of the source of these ideas were in the local pagan faiths of Ireland and Scotland, which would fit under the umbrella of Celtic polytheism. Now, Celtic polytheism is notoriously difficult to find solid sources on. It's largely fallen prey to romanticization, reinvention through Wicca, and it's often got some woo inspiration going on from the fantasy genre rather than historical scholarship. And this makes books on Celtic practices extremely difficult to find. Later, I found out that books by Ronald Hutton or Barry Cunliffe are really good places to start, and their focus is more on academic interpretation rather than any sort of spiritual approach. But for me, personally, I find that to be a more helpful angle for my purposes of Reconstruction. And that means rebuilding these traditions as they were, or at least as close as we can. A more practical challenge with Celtic polytheism, just from a historical perspective, is that it is sorely missing on primary sources. Many forms of polytheist traditions are. For example, a Roman historian named Posidonius wrote a series of 52 volumes called Histories, in which he wrote extensively about the practices and culture of the Celts and several other civilizations, including the understanding of, at the time, of the origin of the cosmos. But no copies of this manuscript exist. None. Only fragments of them, as well as like scant references to it, a few quotes from surviving texts by other authors referencing his authority on these matters, just enough to like tease us about the knowledge that was lost. So learning about the realities of ancient Celtic practices can be a battle, sifting through Christian obfuscation or misrepresentation, Renaissance reinvention, ethno-nationalist repurposing, and herds and herds of fluffy bunnies. And then, once you find the real stuff, you realize the mountains of missing information that simply will never be recovered. It's demoralizing, to be sure, but I don't think that's a reason to give up. For me personally, it's about spiritual exploration, understanding the spirituality not only of my ancestors, but of humans in the past generally. And in a world where the Abrahamic faiths of Christianity and Islam wiped out several perspectives around the world through the practices of cultural erasure through, a peculiar method of conversion, in many cases forcibly so, even against each other and others of their own religion. Rebuilding these ancient faiths is a good way of combating that erasure. But doing so should be done with a method of not falling prey to romanticized images of these ancient cultures.
Have you ever wanted to discover the secrets of ancient magic traditions like black magic, voodoo, Norse sorcery, the clip-off, and more? If you answered yes, then I have great news for you. I can show you how.
be wary of any author that touts a complete understanding of exactly what these ancient societies believed and did, especially in the case of Celtic or Germanic polytheist traditions. Anyone claiming that is absolutely lying for a couple of reasons. One, that information by any understanding of complete just isn't accessible. And two, Celtic and Germanic, as well as other traditions, were not monolithic. Different peoples in different areas viewed the gods differently and practiced differently. So with all that in mind, about the landscape that we're dealing with, where do you actually start? Well, I mean, it depends on a number of factors. So what tradition do you feel called to pursue? What gods have you found a connection with? And is your interest purely academic, or do you have a spiritual goal of some kind? Now, there's several ideas within polytheism that just aren't accessibly, they're just not accessibly written sources on. But I'll do you guys a secret favor since you're in my audience. I'll give you guys a handful of sources that I've read that I think are good starting points. And where you start will vary on the basis of your starting point and kind of like what you're comfortable with, which I'll explain. But I'll also preface that as a heathen, I'm giving you sources that are mostly heathen specific, but I'll throw in a couple of other things as well. First are just some genuine starting points. These are two sources that are great if you don't have a lot of familiarity with heathenry at all, and you just want to understand the basic concepts of heathenry. And there's a lot of 101 books out there on heathenry, and I haven't read them all, and I'm only comfortable suggesting books that I've read to completion, as there is a proclivity with some of these 101 books to be crypto-fascist and ethno-nationalist, which is something just to be aware of when diving into these sources. It sucks to have to point that out, but it's just simply a reality of the landscape. The first I'm going to suggest is The Practical Heathen's Guide to Asatru. This is a great 101 book that has mostly good information in it. I have a few disagreements with it here and there, but ultimately it's a really good starting point for anyone that's interested in learning about heathenry. An example of my disagreement with it is that I think that the suggested rituals are they're pretty bad, but the information in it is otherwise pretty solid. So it's written by a practitioner, so you can consider that bias if you want, or you can see that as an advantage. It depends on kind of like what you're looking for and why you're reading the book. But it's something to know, and you should consider with this book. The second is The Viking Spirit. The author here is not a practitioner, but someone who's very knowledgeable about Norse mythology, the Norse sagas, and Norse culture, and he writes about it honestly and accessibly. And this isn't like a slog of a history text. It's quite an engaging read. And every once in a while you get the author's opinions on things, but he's pretty good at explaining when he's doing that. This book also contains prose retellings of the Norse legends from the Eddas, if you're interested in reading that. A bonus source would be the Poetic Edda and Norse myths. Obviously, I should include the Poetic Edda here, which is it's a Christian source documenting the heathen myths of Iceland. And this is one of the closest sources we have to the actual stories of the gods. And if you dig reading, medieval poetry, the Poetic Edda is for you. But it should be kept in mind that this is a source, like many others that we have, that is written through a Christian lens of preservation. And that comes with certain biases. So, if you see medieval poetry as a bit of a slog to read, which it objectively is, then you can pick up a prose rewriting of these myths by Kevin Crossley Holland, which is an honest prose retelling of these same myths. Contained within the Eddas is a particular poem called the Hávamál, which is the words of Odin, and it's often sold as its own volume. And if you want to get a quick and dirty understanding of heathen morality, I suggest picking up this one. Though it should be understood that the Hávamál, like any spiritual text, exists within the context of its own time period. The sayings in the Hávamál are often referenced by heathens as part of their justification for certain actions. A phrase that's common among heathens, no frith with fascists, is rooted in an interpretation of the Hávamál. And the Hávamál reads very similarly to sources like the Tao Te Ching, which are lists of sayings. And some of the sayings in the Hávamál build small stories of Odin, which makes it a good introductory source to get started with as a heathen. A source that I've used as a citation on this channel a few times is Stephen Dillon's The Case for Polytheism. And I think this is a good source if you want to get into a polytheist response to a lot of monotheist and atheist philosophical arguments. And you get to see a structured polytheist response to classical theism. Dillon is a PhD in philosophy and a very good writer. And it's also a fairly quick read. It's around 100 pages. But it's a good book to come to if you already have a decent grounding in philosophical terms and argumentation. It's not a heavily advanced book in this sense, but it's not really a beginner's book either. And I'll round this list off with one of my favorites. A World Full of Gods is a polytheist philosophy book written by a non-philosopher. The author is a druid who writes basically to give philosophical arguments and justifications for his position, and also discusses some cultural and practical elements of polytheist practice and distinctions from more common religions such as Christianity. It's written fairly accessibly, but like the case for polytheism, this is one that you should have a basic grounding in philosophy terms before really tackling. But something that I really like about it is that it's good at structuring mindset. It gets you to think a little outside the box. It's a perceptive book, and that's something I really like about it. And with that, I'm Ocean Keltoy, and I hope you enjoyed that. And I want to know what you guys think about this. Do you think that you're going to pick up one of these books? Which one do you think you'll snag and why? And is there another source that you think should have been on this list that I didn't include, or that you have questions about? Let me know in the comments down below. And hail to my patrons for making this content possible. I recently shared a picture from Suris's channel that shows how many of his recent videos have been demonetized. And I think it's time to recognize that Patreon is probably the best way to support those of us that cover anything controversial, because YouTube ain't coming into our support. But thanks to everyone for watching, liking, and leaving a comment. And remember to find a way or make one.